Long before the first cities rose from the dust of river valleys, before the earliest written word was pressed into clay, human beings were already telling stories. They were painting on walls deep inside the earth, in places where sunlight never reached, where the only illumination came from flickering torches held in trembling hands. These ancient artists crawled through narrow passages, descended into chambers that felt like the lungs of the world itself, and there, in the profound silence of subterranean darkness, they left behind images that would endure for tens of thousands of years. When we speak of cave art, we are speaking of something far more mysterious than simple decoration. We are speaking of humanity's first permanent attempt to record what they witnessed, what they believed, and what they could not explain. These paintings and carvings represent the earliest visual language our species ever created, and yet, despite more than a century of study, we still do not fully understand what many of these images were meant to convey. The story begins approximately 40,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic period, when modern humans had already spread across much of the globe. In Europe, in Africa, in Australia, and in the Americas, people who had never met one another spoke languages that would never overlap, who lived in environments as different as frozen tundras and scorching deserts, all began to do the same remarkable thing. They began to paint. They began to carve. They began to leave behind visual records of their existence, and within those records, patterns emerge that challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. The most famous cave art sites are found in Western Europe, particularly in France and Spain, where the limestone geology created vast underground networks perfect for preservation. Places like Lascaux, Chauviat, and Altamira have become almost mythical in their reputation, drawing researchers and curious visitors from every corner of the modern world. The animals depicted in these caves are rendered with such skill and grace that they seem to move in the torchlight, their muscles rippling, their eyes alive with something close to consciousness. But the animals are not what concern us tonight. What concerns us are the other figures, the ones that do not fit neatly into any category, the ones that have puzzled archaeologists and anthropologists for generations. Among the horses and bison and mammoths, there are shapes that look almost human, but not quite. There are figures with elongated heads and enormous eyes. There are beings that appear to be wearing suits or helmets. There are entities surrounded by strange geometric patterns that seem to pulse with an energy all their own. For decades, mainstream science has explained these anomalous figures as representations of shamans in trance states, or as stylized depictions of humans engaged in ritual activities. Hey, perhaps some of them are exactly that. But the sheer consistency of certain images across cultures that had no contact with one another raises questions that these explanations cannot fully answer. Why would isolated groups on opposite sides of the planet all choose to depict the same type of being? Why would they all use similar symbols to represent experiences they could not possibly have shared? Consider for a moment what it must have been like to be alive 40,000 years ago. The night sky was unpolluted by artificial light, and the stars blazed with an intensity we can scarcely imagine today. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and the movements of celestial bodies were not abstract concepts, but immediate, visceral experiences. Ancient people watched the sky with an attention we have largely forgotten, and they noticed things. They noticed lights that moved in ways the stars did not. They noticed objects that appeared and disappeared without explanation. They noticed a phenomena that did not fit the natural patterns they had come to understand. It is within this context that we must approach the mystery of cave art. These were not primitive people in the sense that we sometimes imagine. Their brains were identical to ours. Their capacity for observation, for memory, for communication was every bit as sophisticated as our own. When they chose to depict something on a cave wall, they did so with intention. They did so because the subject matter was important enough to warrant the enormous effort required to create such images in the most inaccessible places on Earth. The caves themselves present a mystery within the mystery. Why did ancient artists travel so far underground to create their work? Some chambers containing significant paintings can only be reached after hours of difficult navigation through narrow passages and underground rivers. The effort required to transport pigments, to maintain light sources, to work in cramped and dangerous conditions speaks to a motivation far beyond mere artistic expression. These were sacred spaces, ritual spaces, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else grew thin. Archaeologists have proposed that caves were seen as entrances to the spirit world, as wombs of the earth from which life emerged, as places where communication with other realms became possible. And within this framework, the strange figures painted on these walls take on new significance. If the caves were portals, then the beings depicted there may have been the entities encountered on the other side. But what were those entities? Spirits conjured by shamanic practice, hallucinations induced by sensory deprivation and altered states of consciousness, or something else entirely, something that came from beyond the earth itself. The global distribution of cave art sites ensures that we are not dealing with a single cultural phenomenon that spread through contact and imitation. Australia's Aboriginal rock art traditions developed in complete isolation from those of Europe and Africa for tens of thousands of years. The paintings in the Kimberley region, the Wandjina figures with their haunting, eyeless faces and halo-like headdresses, bear remarkable similarities to images found on the opposite side of the world. The round-headed beings of Tassili in the Sahara, painted when that region was still green and fertile. Echo forms found in the American Southwest thousands of years later. How do we explain these parallels? One possibility is that they reflect universal aspects of human neurology, that our brains are wired to produce certain types of imagery under certain conditions, and that these images simply emerged independently wherever humans found themselves in altered states. This is the theory of entoptic phenomena, and it has gained considerable traction in academic circles. The geometric patterns, the spirals, and zigzags and lattice can indeed be explained by the visual effects produced when the brain's own neural architecture becomes visible to consciousness during trance states. But this theory struggles to account for the more complex figures, the humanoid beings that appear again and again with such specific characteristics: elongated heads, enormous dark eyes, small or absent mouths, slender bodies, and strange garments that seem to cover them from head to foot. These are not abstract patterns generated by neural noise. These are detailed representations of entities that ancient people clearly believed they were encountering, and the consistency of these representations across cultures and continents suggests that the encounters themselves may have been consistent. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed and allow your mind to drift toward sleep, we will journey together through 40,000 years of human visual history. We will explore caves on every inhabited continent. We will examine the figures that ancient artists considered important enough to preserve for eternity. We will consider the various explanations that have been offered and weigh their strengths and limitations. And we will keep ourselves open to the possibility that the ancients knew something we have forgotten, that they witnessed something we no longer see, that the strange beings on their walls were not merely products of imagination, but records of genuine contact with intelligences beyond our understanding. The journey begins in darkness, as all such journeys must. Picture yourself entering a cave, leaving the sunlight behind, descending into the cool embrace of the earth. The sounds of the surface world fade away. The concerns of daily life lose their urgency. You are entering a space that exists outside of ordinary time, a space where the past and the present merge into something eternal. The torchlight reveals images on the walls around you, images that have waited in silence for countless generations. Images that have something to tell you if only you are willing to listen. In the flickering shadows, you begin to make out shapes. Animals first, the great beasts that once roamed the Ice Age landscapes in vast herds. Their power and beauty are evident in every line, every curve of pigment pressed into stone. But as you move deeper, other figures emerge, figures that stand upright like humans, but are not human. Figures with eyes that seem to watch you from across the millennia. Figures surrounded by symbols that no one has ever fully decoded. Who were they? What did they want? Why did the ancient artists feel compelled to record their presence in these sacred underground chambers? These questions have no easy answers, but they have driven researchers to examine cave art sites around the world with fresh eyes, looking for patterns that earlier generations may have overlooked. What they have found is remarkable. The same types of beings appear again and again, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, suggesting that something genuine lies behind the imagery. Perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind as we begin this exploration is that we are not starting from a position of certainty. We are not here to prove a thesis or defend a conclusion already reached. We are here to examine the evidence with open minds and curious hearts, to consider possibilities that may seem extraordinary at first glance, right, and to follow the trail of clues wherever it leads. The ancient artists left us a message, okay? Our task is to understand what that message contains. So let your body relax completely. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the cares of the modern world dissolve into the background as we travel backward through time. Into the caves where humanity first began to record its encounter with the unknown. The evidence is painted on stone, carved into rock, preserved in the earth like a letter addressed to the future. And tonight, at long last, we are going to read it. The story of cave art is ultimately the story of human consciousness itself, of our species' first attempts to grapple with experiences that exceeded the boundaries of ordinary understanding. Before there were temples, there were caves. Before there were priests, there were shamans. Before there were sacred texts, there were painted walls, okay? And on those walls, among the beautiful animals and the abstract symbols, okay, there are beings that do not belong to this earth, beings that our ancestors took great pains to represent accurately, okay? Beings whose presence suggests that humanity's contact with intelligence from beyond may stretch back to the very dawn of our existence as a species. 40,000 years is an almost inconceivable span of time. Civilizations have risen and fallen, continents have shifted, entire species have come and gone, and yet through all of it, the images on the cave walls have endured, waiting patiently in the darkness for someone to return and try to understand them. We are those people. This is our moment to connect with the artists of the ancient world, to look upon what they looked upon, okay, and to ask the questions they may have asked themselves in the torchlight all those millennia ago. What is out there? What visited us in the distant past? And are they still watching? The limestone hills of southwestern France hold secrets that have waited in silence for longer than human memory can reach. Beneath the vineyards and meadows, beneath the quiet villages where life unfolds in gentle rhythms, okay, there exist networks of underground chambers that once served as cathedrals for a people who left no written records, okay, only images pressed into stone with pigments made from the earth itself. These are the painted caves of Europe, and they represent some of the most extraordinary artistic achievements in the entire span of human existence. Chauvet Cave, discovered only in 1994, pushed back the timeline of sophisticated art by thousands of years. The paintings within its chambers date to approximately 36,000 years ago. Yet, they display a mastery of technique that stunned the researchers who first laid eyes upon them. Here were lions rendered with anatomical precision, horses captured in motion with a dynamism that would not be equaled until the Renaissance, rhinoceroses and bears and creatures long extinct portrayed with an intimacy that could only come from careful observation over many generations. The artists of Chalvet were not primitive scratchings on walls. They were masters of their craft, working within traditions that had already been refined over countless centuries. But Chalvet contains more than animals. Among the herds and predators, there are symbols that defy easy interpretation. Geometric forms appear throughout the cave, dots and lines arranged in patterns that seem to carry meaning beyond mere decoration. There are handprints pressed against the stone, negative images created by blowing pigment around splayed fingers, as if the artists were reaching through the rock itself into another dimension. And there are figures that do not quite fit the naturalistic style of the animal paintings, abstract humanoid shapes that seem to occupy a different category of representation entirely. Lascaux, perhaps the most famous painted cave in the world, was discovered in 1940 by 4 teenagers and their dog exploring the hills above the Vasari Valley. What they found inside has been called the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory, a vast gallery of images dating to approximately 17,000 years ago. The Hall of Bulls alone contains some of the most magnificent animal paintings ever created. Aurochs and horses and deer rendered at monumental scale with a sophistication that takes the breath away. The artists understood perspective, shading, and movement. They used the natural contours of the cave walls to give their subjects three-dimensional presence. They created works of genuine artistic genius in conditions that would challenge modern painters working with every advantage of technology and illumination. Yet, Lascaux also contains one of the most enigmatic images in all of prehistoric art, in a chamber known as the shaft. Accessible only by rope descent, there is a scene that has puzzled researchers for decades. A human figure lies prone, depicted in a crude stick figure style utterly different from the masterful animal paintings elsewhere in the cave. For the figure stands, a wounded bison, its entrails spilling from its body. Beside the human is what appears to be a bird on a pole. The meaning of this scene remains hotly debated. But what strikes many observers is the contrast between the primitive rendering of the human and the sophisticated treatment of everything else. It is as if humans and animals belong to different categories of being in the minds of these ancient artists. Moving west into Spain, we encounter Altamira, the first painted cave to be recognized by the modern world. When the site was initially reported in 1880, the scientific establishment refused to believe that prehistoric people could have created such accomplished artwork. The polychrome bison on Altamira's ceiling, painted with multiple colors and shaded to create remarkable depth, seemed to advance for ancient humans. Accusations of forgery followed the cave's discoverer to his grave. Only decades later, when similar sites were found throughout the region, did the truth become undeniable. Our ancestors were capable of artistic expression that rivaled anything produced in recorded history. Altamira's chambers contain more than bison, of course. There are horses and deer, handprints and geometric signs, and there are figures that do not fit comfortably into any natural category. Among the animal paintings, researchers have identified shapes that appear humanoid but possess characteristics no human being has ever displayed. Elongated forms, unusual proportions, and arrangements of features that suggest something other than straightforward self-portraiture. These anomalous figures tend to receive less attention in popular accounts of the caves, but they are there, waiting to be examined by anyone willing to look beyond the spectacular animal paintings. The cave of La Pasiga, also in northern Spain, contains an image that has attracted considerable attention from those who study anomalous prehistoric art. Among its many paintings, there is a figure that has been nicknamed the astronaut. The designation is not official, of course, and mainstream archaeologists would resist such terminology, but the nickname persists because the figure genuinely resembles a person wearing some kind of suit or protective garment. The head appears enclosed, the body covered in a way that suggests clothing rather than naked skin. What were the artists depicting? A shaman in ritual costume, a mythological being from their oral traditions, or something they actually witnessed, something that arrived from elsewhere and made contact with the people of that distant time? The French caves of Pecmerle and Fontaguillaume add further layers to the mystery. Pecmerle contains the famous spotted horses, dappled creatures that researchers initially assumed were products of artistic imagination, until genetic studies revealed that spotted horses actually existed during the Ice Age. The artists were painting what they saw with documentary accuracy. This discovery has profound implications for how we interpret other images in these caves. If the animals were rendered faithfully from observation, what does that suggest about the humanoid figures that appear alongside them? Fontaguillaume, one of the few painted caves still open to limited public visitation, contains polychrome paintings of remarkable beauty and complexity. But it also contains images that have never been satisfactorily explained. Among them are figures that appear to have disc-shaped or helmet-like structures around their heads. Beings that stand apart from the natural world depicted elsewhere on the walls. These images are often overlooked in favor of the more spectacular animal paintings, but they form part of a pattern that extends far beyond any single cave or region. Throughout the painted caves of Europe, certain motifs appear with striking regularity. Geometric patterns that seem to follow consistent rules of construction, spirals that rotate in predictable directions, grid-like formations that resemble nothing in the natural world, dot sequences that may encode information we have not yet learned to read, and humanoid figures that share characteristics across sites separated by hundreds of miles and thousands of years. The consistency of these elements suggests that they were not random decorations, but meaningful symbols within a system of communication or belief. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for the geometric patterns. The most influential theory holds that they represent entoptic phenomena, visual effects generated by the human nervous system during altered states of consciousness, when the brain is deprived of normal sensory input, or when it is affected by certain substances or practices. It begins to generate its own visual content. Spirals, grids, zigzags, and nested curves are among the most common forms reported by people in trance states across all cultures. Cayley suggests that shamans entering the caves to perform rituals experienced these phenomena and recorded them on the walls as a kind of map of their inner journeys. This explanation has considerable merit when applied to abstract geometric forms, but it struggles to account for the more complex imagery. The beings that appear to be wearing suits and helmets, the figures with oversized eyes and unusual body proportions. These are not the simple patterns generated by neural activity. These are detailed representations of entities that the artists clearly believed they were encountering. And the question remains whether those encounters took place entirely within the human mind, or whether something external was involved. The caves of Europe represent only one chapter in a much larger story. The sophistication of the art found within them demonstrates beyond any doubt that our ancestors possessed intellectual and creative capabilities equal to our own. Keen as observers of the world around them, they developed techniques of representation that required generations of accumulated knowledge to perfect. And when they chose to depict something on a cave wall, they did so with purpose and precision. The anomalous figures that appear among the animals and geometric patterns were not accidents or idle doodlings. They were important enough to include in the most sacred spaces these people knew, important enough to preserve for eternity in the living rock of the earth. As you breathe slowly and allow your body to sink deeper into relaxation, picture yourself standing in one of these ancient chambers. The torchlight flickers against walls that have not changed in 30,000 years. The air is cool and still, carrying a faint mineral scent that speaks of ages beyond counting. All around you, images emerge from the stone. Animals that once thundered across Ice Age plains. Symbols whose meanings hovered just beyond the edge of understanding, and figures that seem to watch you with eyes that are not quite human. What did the artists see? Did they know? What were they trying to tell us across the vast gulf of time that separates their world from ours? The caves of Europe are not the only repositories of ancient imagery that raises these questions. On other continents, in other caves and rock shelters, similar figures appear in similar contexts. The pattern is global, and its implications are profound. But for now, let the images of Lascaux and Chauvet, Kega, settle into your awareness like dreams half remembered upon waking. Let the mystery of the European caves become a doorway through which we will pass into even stranger territories. The beings on the walls are waiting, as they have always waited, for someone to recognize what they represent. The artists who created these masterpieces lived in a world we can barely imagine. Ice sheets covered much of northern Europe. Massive animals roamed landscapes that have long since transformed into farmland and forest. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed eternal, and the darkness of night was absolute in a way we no longer experience. In that world, visions had power. Encounters with the unknown were not dismissed as hallucinations, but treated as genuine contacts with realms beyond ordinary perception. The caves were places where such contacts could be made, recorded, and remembered, and the beings that appear on their walls may be exactly what the artists intended them to be. Visitors from somewhere else entirely, presences that interacted with humanity at the very dawn of our cultural existence. Let these thoughts carry you gently toward sleep, floating on the currents of ancient mystery. The caves remain, their images undimmed by the passage of millennia. And in the silence of the underground darkness, the figures still wait for us to understand. Deep in the heart of the Sahara Desert, where sand dunes stretch toward every horizon and the sun blazes down with merciless intensity, there exists a place that defies everything we think we know about this barren landscape. The Tassili Naja Plateau rises from the desert floor in southeastern Algeria, a vast labyrinth of sandstone formations eroded into fantastic shapes by wind and ancient waters. Today, it is one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, a place where temperatures soar above 50 degrees Celsius and rain falls perhaps once in a decade. But the rocks of Tassili tell a different story, a story of a time when this land was green and fertile, when rivers flowed and lakes sparkled under African skies, and when people gathered to create one of the most extraordinary collections of rock art anywhere in the world. The paintings of Tassili Najura number in the thousands, spread across rock shelters and cliff faces throughout an area of roughly 70,000 square kilometers. They span an enormous range of time, from approximately 12,000 years ago to the relatively recent past, documenting the gradual transformation of the Sahara from savanna to desert. The oldest images show wild animals that could only have lived in a much wetter climate: elephants and giraffes, hippopotamuses and crocodiles, creatures that required abundant water and vegetation to survive. Later paintings depict the arrival of cattle herders, then horse-drawn chariots, and finally camels, marking the progression toward the arid conditions that prevail today. But among the thousands of images at Tassili, there is a category that stands apart from all the others, scattered throughout the plateau, sometimes in isolated locations, and sometimes alongside the animal paintings. There are figures that have come to be known as the Round Heads. These beings are depicted with circular or oval heads, often disproportionately large compared to their bodies. Many appear to be wearing suits or garments that cover them completely. Some have what look like helmets with antennae or other protrusions. Others are surrounded by strange aureoles or emanations that seem to radiate from their forms. They do not look like the human figures painted elsewhere at Tassili. They do not look like anything that walks the earth today. The French explorer Henri Lot led the first major expedition to document the rock art of Tassili in the 1950s. What he found there astonished him. In his published accounts, Lot described the round-head figures with a mixture of wonder and bewilderment. He noted their alien quality, their strange costumes, their poses that suggested activities beyond ordinary human experience. One figure in particular captured his attention and has since become one of the most famous images in all of prehistoric art. Lot called it the Great Martian God. The Great Martian God stands over 5 meters tall, a towering presence painted on a rock shelter wall in the heart of the plateau. The figure is humanoid in basic form, but unlike any human being. Its head is enormous and rounded, with no clear facial features except what might be interpreted as large, dark eyes. Its body appears to be encased in a suit of some kind, with lines suggesting seams or structural elements. Around the figure, smaller beings cluster as if in worship or attendance. The overall impression is of a powerful entity, something that commanded reverence from those who painted it, something that occupied a central place in their spiritual or experiential world. Lot was not a proponent of ancient astronaut theories. He was a serious explorer in ethnography who approached the paintings with scientific rigor. Yet, even he could not resist the impression that the round-head figures seemed to depict something otherworldly. His use of the term Martian was not meant literally, of course, but it captured the essential strangeness of images that did not fit any conventional category. What were the ancient artists painting? What had they seen or experienced that led them to create such extraordinary representations? The Roundhead period at Tassili dates to approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, a time when the Sahara was indeed a very different place. It's covered areas that are now endless sand. Rivers carved channels through landscapes that supported abundant wildlife and human populations. The people who created these paintings lived in a world of relative plenty, with resources sufficient to support settled communities and the leisure time necessary for artistic production. They were not desperate survivors scratching out existence on the edge of oblivion. They were a thriving culture with rich traditions and complex beliefs. Yet, even accounting for the possibility of shamanic visions or mythological narratives, the round-head figures remain puzzling. They are too consistent in their features to be random products of imagination. The same basic form appears again and again across different rock shelters and different time periods within the round-head phase. Large, circular heads. Bodies covered in what appear to be suits or uniforms, strange appendages or equipment. It's an overall impression of beings that are humanoid, but decidedly not human. Whatever the artists were depicting, they clearly believed it was real enough to warrant repeated representation over many generations. Some researchers have proposed that the round-head figures represent humans wearing ritual costumes or masks. Ethnographic parallels exist in various African cultures, where dancers don elaborate outfits to embody spirits or ancestors during ceremonial occasions. This explanation has merit, and it is certainly possible that some of the Tassili figures fall into this category. But it does not fully account for the most extreme examples, the beings with truly enormous heads, the figures that appear to float or fly, the entities surrounded by emanations that suggest something beyond mere costume. Other scholars have suggested that the roundheads represent a now extinct population with different physical characteristics from modern humans. This theory lacks any supporting evidence from the fossil record. The people who lived in the Sahara during the Roundhead period were anatomically modern humans, indistinguishable from populations living elsewhere in Africa at the same time. There is no biological basis for the strange forms depicted on the rock walls. Whatever explanation we seek, it must account for the deliberate artistic choices made by people with normal human bodies, painting beings with decidedly abnormal ones. The Tassili Plateau is not the only location in Africa where such figures appear. Throughout the Sahara and into the Sahel region to the south, rock art sites contain images that share characteristics with the Tassili round heads. The consistency of these representations across thousands of square kilometers suggests a widespread tradition, a shared set of beliefs or experiences that found expression in similar artistic forms. Whatever the people of ancient Africa were encountering, it was not confined to a single location or a single community. Consider the implications of what we are seeing. 8,000 years ago, perhaps longer, people across a vast region of Africa were creating images of beings that do not match any known human or animal form. These images were important enough to paint in sacred spaces, to reproduce across generations, to maintain as a consistent tradition over centuries or millennia. The artists were skilled enough to render animals with naturalistic accuracy when they chose to do so. The strange quality of the round-head figures was not a limitation of technique, but a deliberate choice. It's faithful representation of something the artists considered real and significant. As you rest in the darkness of your own quiet space, let your mind drift to the ancient Sahara, to a time when green valleys stretched between sandstone mountains and people gathered in rock shelters to record their encounters with the unknown. The air would have been cooler then, carrying the scent of grass and water. The night sky would have blazed with stars undimmed by any artificial light, and the silence would have been profound, broken only by the sounds of the natural world going about its eternal business. In that setting, under that sky, what might people have witnessed? What might have descended from the darkness above to make contact with the human communities below? The transformation of the Sahara from fertile grassland to barren desert is one of the great environmental changes in human history. It happened gradually over thousands of years as climate patterns shifted and rainfall diminished. The people who had flourished in the green Sahara were forced to migrate, moving toward the Nile Valley, toward the coasts, toward any region where water remained available. They took their traditions with them, their stories and their memories, but they left their paintings behind on the rocks that had sheltered them for so long. Those paintings remain today, remarkably well preserved by the dry desert air. The colors have faded somewhat, but the images are still clearly visible, still capable of evoking wonder and perplexity in those who journey to see them. The great Martian god still towers on its rock shelter wall, gazing out across a landscape that has changed beyond recognition since the day it was painted. The round-head figures still cluster in their enigmatic poses, still wearing their strange suits and helmets, still surrounded by symbols and emanations that no one has fully decoded. What message were the ancient artists trying to send? What did they want future generations to know about the beings they encountered in the green Sahara? These questions may never be answered with certainty, but they deserve to be asked. The paintings of Tassili are not primitive scratchings by ignorant savages. They are the carefully crafted productions of intelligent people who had something important to communicate. And among all the things they chose to depict, among all the animals and humans and activities of daily life, they gave special prominence to beings that did not belong to the ordinary world, beings that seemed to have come from somewhere else entirely. The African rock art tradition extends far beyond the Sahara, of course. From the Cape of Good Hope to the Horn of Africa, ancient people left images on rocks and in caves that document their lives, their beliefs, and their encounters with the unknown. Many of these images are straightforward representations of animals and humans, hunting scenes and ritual activities, the ordinary stuff of daily existence, but here and there scattered across the continent like seeds waiting to sprout. There are figures that echo the round heads of Tassili, beings that do not fit any natural category, entities that seem to have made their presence known to human communities throughout African prehistory. Let these images settle into your awareness as you drift toward sleep. Picture the ancient Sahara in its time of abundance, the lakes and rivers, the herds of wild animals, the communities of people living in harmony with a generous land. Picture them looking up at the night sky, watching lights move among the stars, witnessing descents and landings and contacts that would shape their understanding of the cosmos forever. Picture them retreating to their rock shelters, mixing their pigments, and painting what they had seen so that future generations would know, would remember, would understand that humanity has never been alone. The Roundheads still watch from their stone galleries, patient and eternal. The great Martian god still presides over ceremonies that ended thousands of years ago. And the mystery of what the ancient Africans encountered in their green and fertile homeland remains as compelling today as it was when Henry Lote first gazed upon those strange figures and reached for the only word that seemed to fit. Martian, alien, other, something. Not of this earth. Sleep now, and let the dreams come. The ancient painters are waiting to show you what they saw. On the far side of the world, from Europe and Africa, across vast stretches of ocean that ancient peoples had no means to cross, another tradition of rock art was developing in isolation. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia arrived on that continent at least 65,000 years ago, making them the inheritors of the longest continuous culture in human history. For tens of thousands of years, they lived without contact from the outside world, developing their own languages, their own spiritual traditions, and their own artistic practices entirely independent of anything happening elsewhere on Earth. And yet, when we examine the rock art they created, we find images that bear remarkable similarities to those painted in caves on other continents. Images of beings that do not belong to the natural world, beings that seem to have come from the sky. The Kimberley region of northwestern Australia is one of the most remote and rugged landscapes on the planet. Red sandstone cliffs rise above tangled forests, and ancient rock shelters. The terrain like entries in a ledger of time beyond measuring. Within these shelters, painted on surfaces that have been protected from the elements for millennia, there are figures that have haunted the imaginations of all who have seen them. They are called the Wandjina, and according to Aboriginal tradition, they are not mere paintings at all. They are the actual presence of powerful beings who came from the sky at the beginning of time and who remain embedded in the rock to this day. The Wandjina figures are instantly recognizable. They have large, rounded heads surrounded by what appears to be a halo or headdress, often depicted with radiating lines that suggest emanation or power. Their eyes are enormous, dark, and compelling, dominating faces that possess no mouths whatsoever. Their bodies are painted in white, sometimes with elaborate chest decorations or markings that may represent internal organs or spiritual attributes. They stand or float against the rock surface with an otherworldly presence that transcends mere artistic representation. To the Aboriginal peoples who have maintained these paintings for countless generations, the Wandjina are not symbols or metaphors. They are real beings, as real as the land itself, and their power remains active in the world. The oral traditions surrounding the Wandjina are as remarkable as the paintings themselves. According to the Aboriginal elders who keep these stories alive, the Wandjina came from the Milky Way in the distant past. They descended to Earth and traveled across the landscape, creating features of the terrain, establishing sacred sites, and teaching the first people how to live. When their work was complete, they did not die in any ordinary sense. Instead, they entered the rock itself, leaving their images behind as permanent records of their presence. The paintings are not commemorations of beings who have departed. They are the beings themselves, still present, still watching, still capable of affecting the world around them. This understanding shapes the way Aboriginal people interact with the Wandjina paintings. The images are not static artifacts from a vanished past, but living presences that require ongoing relationship and care. Traditional custodians have the responsibility of repainting the Wandjina figures at regular intervals, freshening the images and maintaining the connection between the beings and the human communities that depend on them. This practice has continued for thousands of years, creating a direct line of transmission from the original painters to the present day. When we look at a Wandjina painting today, we are not merely seeing the work of ancient artists. We are seeing the latest iteration of an image that has been maintained across more generations than we can easily comprehend. The absence of mouths on the Wandjina figures has attracted particular attention from researchers. Various explanations have been offered, from the suggestion that the beings communicated telepathically to the idea that their power was so great that speech was unnecessary. Aboriginal traditions offered their own explanation, teaching that if the Wandjina were depicted with mouths, the rains would never cease and the world would be flooded. The Wandjina are associated with water, with monsoons, with the life-giving rains that transform the dry landscape into abundance. Their mouthlessness is not a deficiency, but a feature, a representation of power held in check, of forces that could overwhelm the world if not properly contained. The enormous eyes of the Wandjina are equally significant. In Aboriginal understanding, these eyes see everything. Nothing escapes their gaze. T. Wandjina observed human behavior, note transgressions against traditional law, and respond accordingly. Disrespecting a Wandjina site or violating the sacred protocols that govern interaction with these beings can bring serious consequences, including illness, misfortune, or death. This is not superstition in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries. It is a sophisticated understanding of a universe populated by powerful entities whose reality is attested by countless generations of experience and tradition. The Wandjina are not the only unusual figures in Australian rock art, of course. Throughout the continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, Aboriginal peoples created images of beings that transcend ordinary human or animal forms. The Mimi spirits of Arnhem Land are depicted as impossibly thin figures, so slender that they cannot venture outside in windy weather, lest they be broken apart. The Lightning Brothers of the Victoria River region are shown with elaborate headdresses and ceremonial regalia associated with the storms that bring both destruction and renewal. Everywhere we look in Aboriginal art, we find beings that inhabit a space between the human and the cosmic, entities that connect the everyday world, two dimensions beyond ordinary perception. What makes the Wandjina particularly compelling in the context of our exploration is the consistency of their depiction across vast stretches of time and space. The same basic form, the halo-surrounded head, the enormous eyes, the absent mouth, appears at sites throughout the Kimberley region. The tradition has been maintained with remarkable fidelity despite the absence of any centralized authority or written documentation. This consistency suggests that the original image was not an arbitrary artistic choice, but a faithful representation of something the artists believed they were accurately depicting, whatever the Wandjina are or were. The Aboriginal peoples who painted them wanted to ensure that the images remained recognizable generation after generation. The parallels between the Wandjina and figures from other parts of the world are difficult to ignore. The Round Heads of Tassili, the helmeted beings of European caves, Wandjina of Australia, share certain fundamental characteristics, despite arising from cultures that had no possible contact with one another. Large heads, prominent eyes, bodies that seem encased or covered, an overall impression of beings that are humanoid but not human. These similarities could be coincidental, the product of universal features of human neurology or psychology that generate similar imagery under similar conditions, or they could reflect something more profound, a shared experience of contact with intelligences that visited human communities across the globe in the distant past. Aboriginal culture offers a framework for understanding these beings that differs markedly from Western scientific approaches. In the Aboriginal worldview, the dreamtime or dreaming is not a mythological past, but an ongoing reality that exists alongside and interpenetrates ordinary existence. The beings of the dreamtime, including the Wandjina, are not characters in stories that happened long ago. They are present realities that continue to shape the world, and that can be encountered by those who know how to approach them properly. K. This understanding challenges Western assumptions about the nature of time, reality, K, and the relationship between human beings and other forms of intelligence. Perhaps the Aboriginal peoples have preserved something that other cultures have forgotten. Perhaps their unbroken tradition of 65,000 years has maintained knowledge that was once more widespread, but that was lost as other cultures underwent transformations that severed their connections to the deep past. The Wandjina paintings may not be mere art or mere mythology, but actual records of encounters that shaped human consciousness at its earliest stages. The beings depicted on those rock shelter walls may be exactly what the Aboriginal traditions claimed them to be. Visitors from the Milky Way who descended to Earth, interacted with humanity, and left permanent traces of their presence in stone as you rest in comfortable darkness. Allow your imagination to travel to the red rocks of the Kimberley, shelters where Wandjina figures have watched over the land for longer than any human record extends. Picture the enormous eyes gazing outward, seeing everything, missing nothing. Picture the halo of power radiating from heads that contain knowledge beyond human understanding. Picture the absent mouths holding back the floods, keeping the world in balance. Okay? These are not primitive fantasies painted by ignorant people. Okay? They are sophisticated representations of beings that an entire culture has maintained relationship with across more time than Western civilization has existed. The Wandjina still watch. The traditions still continue. Aboriginal elders still repaint the sacred images, still tell the stories, still maintain the protocols that govern proper relationship with these powerful presences. In a world that has largely forgotten its connection to the cosmos, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia have preserved something precious, living link to a time when human beings understood themselves as part of a larger community of intelligences, a community that extended beyond the earth to the stars from which the Wandjina came. Let these images settle into your awareness as sleep approaches. The large round heads, the enormous, compelling eyes, the mysterious absence of mouths, the halos of power and presence. 40,000 years of continuous tradition cannot be easily dismissed. 65,000 years of Aboriginal presence on the Australian continent represent an unbroken chain of memory that stretches back to the very origins of human consciousness. If any culture can claim to have preserved accurate knowledge of humanity's earliest encounters with the unknown, it is this one. And what they have preserved speaks of beings from the sky, beings of immense power, beings whose images still hold presence and potency in the rock shelters of a land as old as human dreaming. The Wandjina came from the Milky Way. They created the world. They taught the people. They entered the rock and remain there still. This is not mythology in the sense of invented stories. This is history preserved in a form that Western minds struggle to accept. And the paintings on the rock shelter walls are not just art. They are witnesses, testimonies, permanent records of contact between humanity and intelligences from beyond the earth. Breathe deeply and let go. The Wandjina are watching, as they have always watched, their enormous eyes filled with knowledge of things we have only begun to remember. Across the Atlantic Ocean and thousands of miles from the painted caves of Europe, another continent was developing its own traditions of rock art in complete isolation from the old world. The Americas were populated by successive waves of migration beginning at least 15,000 years ago, and perhaps much earlier as people crossed from Asia during periods when lower sea levels exposed land bridges and ice-free corridors. These migrants brought with them the full range of human capabilities, including the impulse to create permanent images on stone. And over the millennia that followed, they produced rock art that rivals anything found elsewhere on Earth. And among the many images they created, there are figures that echo the strange beings we have encountered in Europe, Africa, and Australia. Beings that do not belong to the ordinary world, beings that seem to have come from somewhere beyond. The American Southwest holds some of the most haunting rock art on the planet, in the Red Rock country of Utah. where sandstone cliffs glow like embers at sunset, and the landscape seems to belong to another world entirely. Ancient artists created images that have puzzled observers since they were first documented by Western explorers. Sego Canyon, located near the town of Thompson Springs, contains panels of rock art spanning thousands of years and representing multiple cultural traditions. But it is the oldest images at Sego Canyon that captured our attention tonight. The Barrier Canyon-style figures that date to somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 years ago, though some researchers believe they may be considerably older. The Barrier Canyon style is named for a site in Canyonlands National Park where particularly fine examples were discovered, but the style appears throughout the Colorado Plateau region. Its defining characteristics are immediately striking. The figures are typically life-sized or larger, with elongated bodies that taper toward the bottom, often lacking arms or legs entirely. Their heads are frequently decorated with elaborate headdresses, horns, or antenna-like projections. Their eyes, when present, are large and hollow, staring outward with an intensity that transcends the millennia. Many figures appear to float against the rock surface, their tapering bodies giving no indication of contact with the ground. The overall impression is of beings that are not quite human, entities that exist in a state between the physical and the spiritual. At Sego Canyon itself, the Barrier Canyon-style figures are particularly striking. They stand in rows on the cliff face, their dark bodies contrasting sharply with the lighter sandstone behind them. Some have what appear to be insect-like eyes, bulging and segmented. Others display elaborate patterns on their torsos that might represent clothing, body paint, or internal structures not visible in ordinary human anatomy. A few seem to have multiple faces or heads, suggesting transformative states or compound beings that combine different forms into single entities. Whatever these figures represent, they were clearly important to the people who created them. Important enough to paint at monumental scale in locations that would have required considerable effort to access. The conventional explanation for Barrier Canyon-style figures holds that they represent shamanic visions. The beings encountered during trance states induced by fasting, sensory deprivation, or the ingestion of psychoactive substances. This explanation has merit, and it aligns with what we know about shamanic practices in many cultures around the world. The elongated bodies, the floating postures, the elaborate headdresses all find parallels in ethnographic accounts of visionary experiences, tangibly, but as with similar explanations offered for European and African rock art, this theory struggles to account for the consistency and specificity of the imagery, at which shamans across a vast region over thousands of years encountered the same types of beings and represent them in the same basic ways. The Fremont and ancestral Puebloan peoples who inhabited the American Southwest in later periods created their own distinctive rock art traditions, often in close proximity to older Barrier Canyon-style panels. Their images are quite different in character, depicting humans engaged in recognizable activities, tribal species, and abstract designs with clear geometric structure. The contrast between these later traditions and the Barrier Canyon style is instructive. It demonstrates that the ancient artists were capable of creating straightforward representational images when they chose to do so. The strange, otherworldly quality of the Barrier Canyon figures was not a limitation of technique, but a deliberate choice, a faithful representation of something the artists believed they were accurately depicting. Moving south into Central and South America, we encounter rock art traditions that extend back thousands of years and encompass an enormous range of styles and subjects. The famous Nazca lines of Peru are not rock art in the traditional sense. They represent a related impulse, the desire to create images visible from great heights, images that seem designed to be seen from the sky rather than from ground level. The enormous geoglyphs depicting animals, plants, and geometric shapes have attracted speculation about their purpose for decades. Why would ancient people invest such enormous effort in creating images that could only be properly viewed from above. Were they intended for the gods? For beings that traveled through the air? For intelligences that looked down upon the earth from positions no ordinary human could reach? The rock shelters and cave walls of South America contain their own share of mysterious figures. In Brazil, the Serra da Capivara National Park preserves rock paintings dating back at least 25,000 years, making them among the oldest in the Americas. Among the many images at this site, there are figures that display characteristics now familiar from our survey of global rock art. Elongated heads, unusual body proportions, and poses that suggest abilities beyond ordinary human capacity appear alongside more conventional representations of animals and daily activities. The pattern we have observed on other continents repeats itself here as well. Strange beings mixed among the ordinary entities that do not fit any natural category painted with obvious care and intention. The indigenous peoples of the Americas developed rich mythological traditions that speak of beings from the sky, of ancestors who descended from the stars, of powerful entities that interacted with humanity in the distant past. The Hopi people of the American Southwest tell of the ant people who sheltered their ancestors underground. During times of catastrophe, beings depicted in their art with elongated bodies and large heads. Tana recorded detailed astronomical observations and spoke of gods who came from the heavens to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Throughout the Americas, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, indigenous traditions preserve memories of contact with intelligences that were not of this earth. These traditions are often dismissed by Western scholars as primitive mythology, the imaginative products of pre-scientific minds struggling to explain natural phenomena they could not understand. But this dismissal carries its own assumptions about the nature of knowledge and the limitations of known Western ways of knowing. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were sophisticated observers of the natural world. They developed agricultural techniques, astronomical systems, and medical practices that rivaled or exceeded those of contemporary Old World civilizations. When they reported encounters with beings from the sky, they were not speaking from ignorance, but from experience. Experience that was important enough to preserve across countless generations through oral tradition and visual art. The rock art of the Americas spans an enormous range of time, from the earliest human presence on the continent to the period of European contact and beyond. Throughout this vast span, certain motifs appear again and again, suggesting continuity of experience or belief that transcends individual cultures and time periods. Things with unusual heads, figures surrounded by radiating lines or halos, entities that seem to float or fly rather than stand on solid ground. These images echo what we have found in Europe, Africa, and Australia, adding another layer of evidence to the global pattern of anomalous rock art figures. As you settle deeper into relaxation, picture yourself standing before the cliff face at Sego Canyon as the desert sun begins to set. The rock glows with warm light, and the ancient figures painted there seem to emerge from shadow, their hollow eyes watching as they have watched for thousands of years. The vast silence of the canyon country stretches toward every horizon, a landscape of buttes and mesas, of hidden valleys and secret springs, of spaces that still hold mystery despite everything the modern world has done to catalog and explain. In this setting, under this sky, it becomes possible to imagine what the ancient artists might have experienced, what they might have seen that led them to create such haunting images. The beings at Sego Canyon do not look like shamans in trance. They do not look like humans wearing costumes or masks. They look like something else entirely. Something that made such a profound impression on the people who witnessed them that the memory had to be preserved in stone. Their elongated forms, their hollow eyes, their elaborate headdresses or antenna-like projections all speak of encounters with intelligences fundamentally different from anything in ordinary human experience. Whether these encounters took place in physical reality, in visionary states, or in some liminal space between the two. They were real enough to the ancient artists to warrant permanent documentation. The Americas offer a unique perspective on the global phenomenon of anomalous rock art, because the indigenous cultures here developed in isolation from those of the Old World for so long. Whatever generated the images we find at Sego Canyon and throughout the continent, it was not borrowed from Europe or Africa or Australia. It arose independently from experiences that were apparently universal enough to produce similar imagery across the entire inhabited world. This pattern demands explanation, and the explanations offered by mainstream archaeology feel increasingly inadequate to account for what we observe. Let your breathing slow and deepen as you contemplate the mystery of American rock art. From the red rock canyons of Utah to the tropical forests of Brazil, from the high deserts of Peru to the frozen north of Alaska, ancient peoples created images of beings that do not belong to the ordinary world. They did so with skill and intention, maintaining traditions across thousands of years and countless generations. They did so because the beings they depicted were important, powerful, and real in some sense that our modern categories struggle to capture. The figures at Sego Canyon still stand vigil on their cliff face, their hollow eyes still watching, their elongated bodies still floating against the ancient stone. They have outlasted the cultures that created them, outlasted the languages spoken by the artists who mixed the pigments and applied them to rock. They will outlast us as well. These silent witnesses to encounters that shaped human consciousness in ways we are only beginning to understand, in their patience, in their persistence, in their enigmatic presence. They offer testimony to something profound, something that connects the Americas to every other continent where humans have painted strange beings on stone. Rest now in the embrace of ancient mystery. The beings of Sego Canyon are not going anywhere. They have waited for thousands of years, and they will wait for thousands more. In the silence of the desert night, under stars that their creators watched with wondering eyes, they hold their secrets close, waiting for humanity to remember what we once knew. The rock art of the Americas joins the global chorus of anomalous images, adding its voice to a song that began before history and continues to the present day. Something happened in the distant past, something that people on every inhabited continent felt compelled to record. The beings they painted were not imaginary. They were not decorative. They were something that needed to be remembered, something that future generations needed to know about, and though the artists themselves have long since returned to the earth, their message endures on stone, patient and permanent, waiting for us to understand. The continents we have explored so far represent only part of the global tapestry of anomalous rock art. As we turn our attention to Asia and the scattered islands of the Pacific, we find that the pattern continues unbroken, from the subcontinent of India to the valleys of the Italian Alps, from the ancient shores of Japan to the remote islands of Oceania. Human beings have been creating images of strange beings for as long as they have been creating images at all. The consistency of this phenomenon across such vast distances and diverse cultures demands our attention. Something was happening in the ancient world, something that left traces on every continent where humans made their home. The Charma region of Chhattisgarh in central India contains cave paintings that have only recently begun to receive serious attention from researchers. In 2014, archaeologists announced the discovery of rock art depicting what appeared to be humanoid figures in suits and disc-shaped objects hovering in the sky. The paintings, estimated to be approximately 10,000 years old, show beings with features that do not match any known human population. Some figures appear to be wearing helmets with antenna-like protrusions. Others are depicted inside or near circular craft that float above the landscape. The local tribal peoples have legends of the Rahala people, small beings who descended from the sky in round flying objects and occasionally took villagers away, some of whom never returned. The Indian archaeologist J.R. Bhagat, who studied the Charama paintings extensively, noted their remarkable similarity to popular depictions of extraterrestrial beings and spacecraft. He suggested that further investigation might require collaboration with agencies like NASA and ISRO to properly understand what the ancient artists were representing. While mainstream archaeology has been cautious about such speculation, the images themselves remain undeniable. They show what they show, and what they show does not fit comfortably into conventional categories of prehistoric art. India's rock art heritage extends far beyond Charama, of course, to Bhimbetka rock shelters. A UNESCO World Heritage Site in Madhya Pradesh contained paintings spanning 30,000 years of human history. Among the many images at Bhimbetka, there are figures that display the now familiar characteristics of anomalous rock art worldwide. Beings with unusual proportions, entities surrounded by strange emanations, humanoid forms that seem to transcend ordinary physical limitations. The ancient inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent were clearly encountering something that demanded visual documentation, something important enough to include in the sacred spaces where they recorded their most significant experiences, far to the northwest, in the alpine valleys of northern Italy. Another remarkable site preserves images that challenge conventional understanding. Val Camonica, a long valley extending from Lake Iseo into the Rhaetian Alps, contains one of the largest collections of prehistoric petroglyphs in the world. Over 300,000 individual figures have been carved into the glacially polished rocks of this valley. Created over a span of more than 8,000 years, among the many images of daily life, hunting scenes, and religious ceremonies, there are figures that have attracted intense scrutiny from those who study anomalous ancient art. The so-called astronaut of Val Camonica is perhaps the most famous of these images. Carved into stone approximately 10,000 years ago, this figure appears to show a being wearing a helmet with radiating lines, holding objects in each hand, and displaying proportions that set it apart from the more naturalistic human figures elsewhere in the valley. Around this central figure, other elements suggest a scene of significance, possibly religious, possibly recording an actual encounter. Mainstream archaeologists interpret the figure as a shaman or priest wearing ritual headgear, and this explanation may well be correct. But the resemblance to modern conceptions of suited figures remains striking, and the question of what inspired the original artists persists. Val Camonica contains numerous other images that resist easy explanation. There are figures that appear to be wearing elaborate costumes or equipment. There are beings depicted with unusual head shapes and body proportions. There are scenes that seem to show objects in flight or entities descending from above. The sheer quantity of unusual images at this single site suggests that the inhabitants of this alpine valley had experiences they considered important enough to record over many millennia. Whether those experiences were purely internal, the products of ritual practice and altered states, whether they involved contact with something external, remains an open question. Across the vastness of Asia, from the steppes of Central Asia to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, rock art traditions flourished for thousands of years. In each region, among the many images of animals and humans and the activities of daily life, there appear figures that do not quite fit. Beings with oversized heads and eyes, canidies that seem to float or fly, humanoid forms surrounded by strange symbols or emanations. The pattern is remarkably consistent, transcending the enormous cultural and geographic diversity of the Asian continent. Japan offers a unique perspective on this phenomenon through its tradition of dagu figurines. These small clay sculptures, produced during the Jomon period between approximately 14,000 and 3,000 years ago, display characteristics that have fascinated observers since they were first systematically studied. Many dogu have large, goggle-like eyes that seem to stare with unsettling intensity. Their bodies are often decorated with elaborate patterns that might represent clothing, tattoos, or something else entirely. Some figures appear to be wearing helmets or headgear of complex design. The overall impression is of beings that, while humanoid in basic form, possess features that set them apart from ordinary human representation. The most famous type of dogu, the Shikoki dogu, or goggle-eyed figurine, bears a remarkable resemblance to modern depictions of beings in protective suits or space gear. The enormous eyes, the segmented or articulated body, the strange proportions all contribute to an image that seems to come from science fiction rather than prehistoric Japan. What were the Jomon people representing when they created these figures? Some researchers believe the dogu were fertility symbols or representations of goddesses. Others suggest they were used in healing rituals, with the clay figures serving as repositories for illness or misfortune. But the specific features of the dogu, particularly the goggle eyes and elaborate body markings, remain difficult to explain within these frameworks. The connection between the dogu and rock art lies in the broader question of what ancient peoples were experiencing and representing. While the dogu are three-dimensional sculptures rather than flat paintings, they participate in the same global phenomena of anomalous imagery, depicted in Jomon clay, share characteristics with the beings painted on rock walls in Europe, Africa, Australia, and the Americas, cross enormous distances and through completely independent cultural developments. Humans were creating images of entities that transcend ordinary human form. The islands of the Pacific, scattered across the largest ocean on Earth, preserved their own traditions of rock art and carved imagery, from the famous moai of Easter Island to the petroglyphs of Hawaii, from the rock paintings of New Guinea to the carved figures of the Marquesas. Pacific peoples created images that speak of encounters with the extraordinary. Many Pacific cultures preserve oral traditions of sky beings, of ancestors who came from the stars, of powerful entities who descended to teach humanity the arts of navigation, agriculture, and spiritual practice. These traditions find visual expression in art that shares features with what we have observed on every other continent. The global distribution of anomalous rock art figures represents perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence in the entire ancient astronaut discussion. We're not dealing with a single tradition that spread through cultural contact and imitation. We're dealing with independent developments on every inhabited continent, separated by oceans that ancient peoples could not cross, and by time spans that preclude any possibility of transmission. The consistency of the imagery demands explanation. Why would isolated cultures, with no knowledge of each other's existence, all choose to depict beings with the same basic characteristics? Why would they all consider these beings important enough to include in their most sacred artistic productions? The conventional explanation that these images represent shamanic visions produced by the universal structure of the human brain has considerable appeal. It accounts for the similarities by pointing to shared neurology rather than shared experience. But this explanation has limitations. While it may account for abstract geometric patterns like spirals and zigzags, it struggles to explain the detailed, consistent features of the humanoid beings. The large heads, the enormous eyes, the unusual body proportions. The strange garments or suits appear too specific and too consistent to be products of neural noise. Something more seems to be involved. As you allow your body to sink deeper into the comfort of your resting place, consider the scope of what we have surveyed, from the painted caves of France to the rock shelters of Australia, from the desert canyons of Utah to the Charama caves of India, from the alpine valleys of Italy to the clay figurines of ancient Japan. Human beings have been creating images of beings that do not belong to the ordinary world. This is not a regional phenomenon or a cultural quirk. This is a global pattern that extends across 40,000 years of human history and encompasses every continent where humans have made their home. The beings depicted in this worldwide artistic tradition share certain features that transcend cultural boundaries. They tend to have heads that are large in proportion to their bodies, often rounded or elongated. Their eyes are frequently enormous, dark, and compelling. Their bodies are sometimes encased in what appear to be suits or coverings of some kind. They are often surrounded by strange symbols, emanations, or objects that suggest unusual capabilities or origins. They are depicted with care and attention, placed in sacred contexts, maintained across generations with obvious reverence and importance. What were the ancient artists seeing? What experiences led them to create these images with such consistency across time and space? These questions may never be answered with certainty, but they deserve to be taken seriously. The artists themselves were intelligent, observant people with brains identical to our own. When they chose to depict something, they did so with intention and purpose. The beings on their cave walls and carved into their stones were not random fantasies, but representations of something they considered real and significant. Let the images from around the world blend together in your relaxing mind. It's the Wandjina of Australia, the round heads of the Sahara, the barrier canyon figures of Utah, the helmeted beings of European caves, the suited figures of Chirama, the goggle-eyed dogu of Japan. They form a chorus of voices speaking across the millennia, all saying something similar, all pointing toward a mystery that we have only begun to acknowledge. The ancient world was not as isolated as we sometimes imagined. Something was visiting, making contact, leaving impressions that will last for thousands of years. Breathe slowly and deeply as you contemplate this global mystery. The evidence is carved in stone and painted on cave walls in every corner of the inhabited world. It has waited patiently for generations beyond counting, waiting for a time when humanity might be ready to understand. Perhaps that time is approaching. Perhaps we are finally beginning to ask the right questions about what our ancestors experienced and what they tried so hard to tell us. The beings on the walls are not going anywhere. They will wait as long as necessary for us to remember what we once knew. Rest now in the embrace of global mystery. From every continent, from every ancient culture, the strange beings watch and wait. Their message spans the entire inhabited world, a chorus of silent testimony to something profound that happened in the distant past. Sleep approaches, and with it, the possibility of dreams that might carry echoes of those ancient encounters. The artists are long gone, but their images endure, patient witnesses to a mystery that grows more compelling with every sight we discover, every figure we examine, every connection we recognize across the vast tapestry of human history. We have traveled across continents and through tens of thousands of years, examining the strange figures that ancient peoples painted and carved in their most sacred spaces. Now, it is time to step back and consider the patterns that emerge when we view this global phenomenon as a whole, beyond the humanoid beings themselves. There are symbols and motifs that appear again and again in rock art from every corner of the inhabited world. These recurring elements form a visual vocabulary that transcends cultural boundaries, suggesting either remarkable coincidence, some form of ancient contact we have not yet understood, or experiences so universal that they generated identical imagery wherever humans gathered to record what they witnessed. The spiral is perhaps the most ubiquitous symbol in all of prehistoric art. It appears in the painted caves of Europe, in the rock shelters of Africa, in the petroglyphs of the Americas, in the carved stones of Asia and the Pacific Islands. Spirals rotate clockwise and counterclockwise, expand outward and contract inward, stand alone and combine in complex arrangements. They are scratched into boulders, painted on cliff faces, carved into the floors of sacred chambers. No culture that produced rock art seems to have existed without also producing spirals. Their universality demands explanation. Researchers who studied the neurological basis of visual experience have noted that spirals are among the fundamental forms generated by the human brain during altered states of consciousness. When normal sensory input is reduced or disrupted, the brain begins to produce its own imagery, and spirals are prominent among the shapes that emerge. This phenomenon, known as entoptic imagery, provides a compelling explanation for why spirals appear so universally in prehistoric art. Shamans entering trance states would have experienced these forms directly, and recorded them upon returning to ordinary consciousness. Yet spirals also carry other associations that may be relevant to our inquiry. They suggest movement, energy, vortices of power that draw things in or project them outward. In many cultures, spirals are associated with journeys between worlds, with the passages through which spirits travel, with the cyclical nature of time and existence. When we find spirals carved near images of strange beings, we may be looking at more than abstract decoration. We may be looking at representations of the means by which those beings arrived or departed, the gateways through which contact was established. Disc-shaped objects constitute another recurring motif in ancient rock art at sites around the world. Artists depicted circular or oval forms that hover above the landscape, sometimes with rays emanating from them, sometimes with smaller figures visible inside or around them. The Charma caves of India show disc-like craft explicitly, but they are far from unique. Similar images appear in prehistoric rock art from Africa, from the Americas, from Europe and Asia. These discs are rarely identified as the sun, which tends to be depicted differently in most cultures. They are something else, something that flew through the sky but was not a natural celestial body. The sun itself is indeed a common subject in rock art, but solar imagery tends to follow consistent patterns that distinguish it from the anomalous discs. The sun is typically depicted with a face or with regular, symmetrical rays extending in all directions. It occupies a central, dominant position consistent with its role as the primary source of light and warmth. The mysterious discs, by contrast, often appear in contexts that suggest movement, descent, or interaction with figures on the ground. They lack the stylized faces common in solar imagery. They seem to represent something seen rather than something worshipped. Objects that pass through the sky rather than the eternal fixture that is always hung above. Rays of light constitute another motif that appears with striking regularity. Figures in rock art from multiple continents are shown surrounded by radiating lines that suggest emanation, power, or transformation. The Wandjina of Australia have their halos of white paint. The Round Heads of Tassili display aureoles around their great circular heads. European cave paintings show beings surrounded by lines and patterns that seem to indicate something other than ordinary physical presence. These radiating forms suggest that the beings depicted possess qualities that set them apart from ordinary humans, qualities that manifested visually as light or energy extending from their bodies. The elongated head appears with such consistency across cultures that it cannot be dismissed as an artistic convention or stylistic quirk. From the round heads of the Sahara to the Barrier Canyon figures of Utah, from European cave paintings to Pacific Island carvings, ancient artists depicted beings whose heads were disproportionately large, often stretched or elongated in ways no human skull could achieve. Some cultures practiced cranial modification, binding the heads of infants to produce elongated shapes. But this practice cannot account for the most extreme examples in rock art, nor does it explain why the imagery appears in cultures that did not practice such modification. The consistency of the elongated head motif raises profound questions. Were ancient peoples depicting real beings with unusual cranial structures? Were they representing spiritual entities believed to possess different physical forms than humans? Were they recording memories of contact with intelligences whose biology differed fundamentally from our own? The conventional explanation that these are simply stylized representations of humans or shamanic visions could begin to feel inadequate when we consider how specific and consistent the imagery is across cultures that had no contact with one another. Eyes, particularly large and compelling eyes, form another recurring element. The Wandjina stare with enormous dark eyes that dominate their mouthless faces. The Dogu of Japan peer through goggle-like eye structures that seem to see beyond ordinary vision. Rock art figures from multiple continents display eyes that are oversized, intense, and somehow knowing. There is a visceral quality to these eyes that transcends artistic convention. They seem to look out at the viewer across thousands of years, still watching, still aware, still present in some sense that defies the passage of time. The question we must confront is how to explain these global patterns. Two primary frameworks have been proposed, and they lead to very different conclusions about human history and our place in the cosmos. The first framework holds that the similarities in rock art arise from the shared structure of the human brain. According to this view, all humans experience similar visual phenomena during altered states of consciousness, and all humans draw upon similar symbolic resources when representing the numinous or transcendent. The spiral appears everywhere because human brains generate spirals during trance. The elongated figures appear everywhere because human imagination, when freed from ordinary constraints, tends to stretch and distort the body in particular ways. This neurological framework has been developed most fully by researchers like David Lewis Williams. His work on sand rock art in southern Africa led to broader theories about the shamanic basis of all prehistoric image making. According to Lewis Williams, the painted caves were sites where shamans entered altered states and recorded their experiences. Using a visual vocabulary derived from the entoptic phenomena and hallucinations that occur during trance. This theory has gained considerable acceptance in academic circles and provides elegant explanations for many features of prehistoric art. Yet the neurological framework has limitations. While it can account for abstract geometric patterns like spirals and zigzags, it struggles to explain the detailed, consistent features of the humanoid beings. The specific characteristics we observe, the large heads, the enormous eyes, the strange garments or suits, the absence of mouths in certain traditions, are too particular to be products of generic neural activity. They suggest encounters with specific types of entities, rather than free-floating hallucinations shaped only by brain structure. The second framework holds that the similarities in rock art reflect actual experiences, contacts with intelligences from beyond Earth that occurred in antiquity and were recorded by witnesses across the globe. This is the ancient astronaut hypothesis in its essence, the idea that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in the distant past, interacted with human communities, and left traces of their presence that we can still discern in art, architecture, and mythology. According to this view, the strange beings in rock art are not shamanic visions or stylized humans, but accurate representations of visitors from elsewhere. With these two frameworks, a middle ground exists that draws upon the work of Carl Jung and his concept of the collective unconscious. Jung proposed that beneath the individual human psyche lies a deeper layer shared by all humans, a repository of archetypal images and patterns that emerge independently in cultures around the world. According to this view, the similar beings in global rock art might represent encounters with entities from this collective psychological realm, beings that are real in some sense, but not physical in the ordinary meaning of that word. The archetypes are not extraterrestrial visitors, but something equally mysterious, inhabitants of a psychic dimension that all humans can access under certain conditions. Jung himself was fascinated by the UFO phenomenon and wrote extensively about it. Saw the flying saucer as a modern manifestation of archetypal symbolism, a circular mandala representing wholeness and transcendence. Whether the objects people reported were physically real or psychologically real, they tapped into deep structures of the human mind that had been expressing themselves throughout history. The disc-shaped objects in ancient rock art might be early appearances of the same archetype, emerging into human consciousness whenever conditions were right for such manifestations. As you rest in the gathering stillness of approaching sleep, consider these frameworks and what they imply. The neurological explanation offers comfort in its familiarity, reducing the mystery to processes we can study and understand. The extraterrestrial explanation offers wonder in its radical expansion of what we thought we knew about human history. The Jungian explanation offers a third way, preserving the reality of the experiences while locating their source in unexplored dimensions of mind rather than outer space. Perhaps none of these frameworks captures the full truth. Perhaps the reality is more complex than any single theory can accommodate. The ancient artists may have been encountering something that partakes of all these explanations, something that is both psychological and external, both generated by the mind and independent of it. The beings on the cave walls may exist in a space that our categories cannot adequately map, a space where the boundaries between inner and outer, between psyche and cosmos, break down or reveal themselves to have been artificial all along. What we can say with confidence is that the global consistency of anomalous rock art imagery demands serious attention. This is not a phenomenon that can be dismissed as mere coincidence or as the product of cultural diffusion. The similarities are too specific, the distribution too wide, the time spans too vast for such explanations to suffice. Something was generating these images, something that affected human communities on every inhabited continent over tens of thousands of years. Whether that something was neural, extraterrestrial, archetypal, or something else entirely, it left traces that we are only now beginning to recognize and investigate. Let your mind float freely among these possibilities as sleep draws nearer. The spirals spin in the darkness behind your closed eyes. The disc-shaped objects drift silently across the sky of imagination. The beings with their elongated heads and enormous eyes watch from the edges of consciousness, patient and enigmatic as they have always been. 40,000 years of human wonder and questioning have not resolved the mystery, and perhaps it cannot be resolved. Only approached, contemplated, and allowed to work its strange transformation upon those who take it seriously. The symbols speak across the ages, and their message, whatever it may be, has lost none of its power. The ancient artists were trying to tell us something, and though we cannot yet fully understand their language, we can feel the weight of what they wanted to say. Something extraordinary happened in the distant past, something that marked human consciousness indelibly and left traces that time could not erase. The symbols are keys to that mystery, and somewhere in their recurring patterns lies the truth about what our ancestors experienced and why they considered it so important to preserve. Rest now with the symbols turning gently in your awareness, spirals and discs, rays of light in elongated forms, eyes that see across millennia, and bodies that transcend ordinary flesh. The vocabulary of ancient mystery surrounds you, inviting contemplation, inviting wonder, inviting the possibility that everything we thought we knew about human history might be only a fraction of a much larger story. The mystery of anomalous rock art has not escaped the attention of mainstream science. For more than a century, archaeologists, anthropologists, and neuroscientists have grappled with the question of what ancient peoples were depicting when they created images that seemed to transcend ordinary human experience. The explanations they have offered deserve careful consideration, for they represent the best thinking of dedicated researchers who have spent their careers studying with these images and the cultures that produce them. Understanding these scientific perspectives is essential before we can fairly evaluate alternative interpretations. The shamanic trance theory stands as the dominant framework within contemporary archaeology for understanding prehistoric rock art. This theory was developed most comprehensively by David Lewis Williams, a South African researcher who spent decades studying the rock art of the Sand People, the indigenous hunter-gatherers whose traditions extend back thousands of years. Lewis Williams observed that sand rock art contained imagery that corresponded closely to the experiences described by sand shamans entering altered states of consciousness. The geometric patterns, the therianthropic figures combining human and animal features, and the depictions of trance states themselves all suggested that the art was recording visionary experiences rather than observations of the physical world. From this foundation in sand ethnography, Lewis Williams extended his theory to encompass rock art worldwide. He proposed that all prehistoric rock art, from the painted caves of Europe to the shelters of Australia, arose from shamanic practices involving altered states of consciousness. The universality of certain images, particularly geometric forms like spirals, grids, and zigzags, could be explained by the universal structure of the human nervous system. When the brain enters certain states, it generates predictable visual phenomena that people across cultures have experienced and recorded. The neurological basis of this theory rests on the concept of entoptic phenomena. Toptic images are visual experiences that originate within the eye and brain rather than from external light entering the visual system. They can be produced by various means, including pressure on the eyeballs, flickering light, sensory deprivation, hyperventilation, and the ingestion of psychoactive substances. The forms that emerge during entoptic experience follow consistent patterns that have been documented through laboratory research and cross-cultural comparison. Spirals, nested curves, grids, parallel lines, dots, and meandering forms appear reliably across different methods of induction in different cultural contexts. Phosphenes represent a related phenomenon that contributes to the shamanic trance theory. These are visual sensations caused by mechanical, electrical, or magnetic stimulation of the retina or visual cortex, producing the experience of seeing light without light actually entering the eye. When you close your eyes and press gently on your eyelids, the patterns you see are phosphenes. They too follow consistent forms and may have contributed to the geometric imagery found in prehistoric art worldwide. Lewis Williams proposed a three-stage model of trance experience that maps onto the imagery found in rock art. In the first stage, the person experiencing altered consciousness perceives entoptic forms floating against a background that may be the surrounding environment or an internal visual field. In the second stage, the brain begins to interpret these abstract forms, transforming them into meaningful images through a process of elaboration. A spiral might become a tunnel, A grid might become a net or enclosure. In the third and deepest stage, the person experiences vivid hallucinations that may include encounters with beings, journeys to other realms, and transformations of identity. The strange humanoid figures in rock art, according to this model, represent beings encountered in this third stage of trance. This theory has considerable explanatory power. It accounts for the presence of geometric forms in rock art across cultures. It explains why rock art often appears in deep caves or remote locations where sensory deprivation would facilitate altered states. It connects prehistoric imagery to documented practices in surviving shamanic cultures, and it provides a naturalistic framework that does not require invoking extraterrestrial intervention or other extraordinary explanations. Yet, the shamanic trance theory also has limitations that its proponents sometimes understate. While it can account for abstract geometric imagery, it struggles to explain the detailed, consistent features of the humanoid beings. The entoptic phenomena, documented in laboratory settings, are relatively simple forms, not the complex entities with specific anatomical features that appear in rock art worldwide. The progression from simple entoptic forms to detailed humanoid beings requires a leap that the theory does not fully justify. Furthermore, the consistency of the humanoid imagery across cultures poses a challenge. If the beings in rock art were purely products of individual hallucination, shaped by the particular cultural context of each artist, we would expect much more variation than we observe. The fact that beings with elongated heads, large eyes, and unusual body proportions appear in the art of cultures on opposite sides of the world, cultures with no contact and vastly different belief systems, suggest that something more than generic trance experience is involved. Mainstream archaeology tends to approach anomalous rock art with a stance of cautious skepticism toward extraordinary interpretations. The principle of parsimony, often invoked in scientific reasoning, suggests that we should prefer simpler explanations over more complex ones when both account for the evidence equally well. From this perspective, explaining rock art as a product of shamanic trance is preferable to explaining it as evidence of extraterrestrial contact, okay? Because the shamanic explanation requires only phenomena we know to exist, while the extraterrestrial explanation requires the existence of beings we have not confirmed. This methodological conservatism serves important functions. It prevents the proliferation of unfounded speculation and maintains standards of evidence that have served science well over centuries. But it can also become a barrier to inquiry when it forecloses consideration of possibilities that, while extraordinary, might actually be true. But the history of science includes numerous examples of phenomena that were dismissed as impossible until accumulating evidence forced reconsideration. But the question is whether anomalous rock art represents such a case. Some researchers have proposed alternative interpretations that fall between the extremes of shamanic hallucination and extraterrestrial contact. One such interpretation holds that the beings in rock art represent members of other human populations, perhaps groups with different physical characteristics or cultural practices that seemed alien to the artist. This theory can account for some images, but not for the most extreme examples, where the beings depicted possess features no human population has ever displayed. Another alternative suggests that the beings represent spiritual entities from the mythological frameworks of the cultures that produced the art. Every human society has developed beliefs about non-physical beings, spirits, gods, and ancestors who interact with the living. The strange figures in rock art might be representations of these entities, painted in sacred spaces where communication with the spirit world was believed to occur. This interpretation has merit, but it simply pushes the question back one level. Where did the beliefs in these specific types of beings originate? Why would cultures around the world, developing their mythologies independently, all arrive at such similar conceptions of what spiritual beings look like? The limitations of conventional explanations become particularly apparent when we consider the disc-shaped objects that appear in ancient rock art. These are not easily attributed to entoptic phenomena or shamanic visions. They are too specific in their form to consistently depicted in contexts suggesting flight or descent, and too closely matched to modern reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. When ancient artists depicted circular craft hovering in the sky, sometimes with figures visible inside them, they were recording something more particular than generic trance imagery. Similarly, the apparent technological elements in some rock art figures resist conventional explanation. Beings that seem to be wearing helmets, suits, or other equipment do not fit comfortably into the shamanic framework. While it is possible to interpret these elements as ritual costumes or stylized representations of shamanic regalia, the specificity and consistency of the imagery suggests that something more is being recorded. The artists were painting what they saw, and what they saw included beings with equipment or attributes that set them apart from ordinary human form. As you settle deeper into the relaxation of approaching sleep, consider the position of mainstream science on these matters. The experts who have dedicated their careers to studying rock art are not fools or closed-minded dogmatists. They have developed theories that account for much of what we observe, and those theories deserve respect. But they have not provided fully satisfying explanations for everything. The anomalies remain, the patterns persist, and the question of what the ancient artists were really depicting has not been resolved. Science progresses through the tension between established frameworks and anomalous observations that do not quite fit. The shamanic trance theory represents a sophisticated attempt to account for rock art within a naturalistic framework. Its limitations point toward areas where our understanding remains incomplete. Perhaps future research will refine the theory to better account for the specific features of anomalous imagery. Perhaps entirely new frameworks will emerge that integrate insights from multiple perspectives. Perhaps the ancient astronaut hypothesis, currently relegated to the margins of academic discourse, will gain consideration as the evidence accumulates and the limitations of alternatives become harder to ignore. What we can say with confidence is that the mystery has not been solved. The beings on the cave walls have not been explained away. The patterns that span continents and millennia have not been reduced to neural noise or cultural convention. Something generated this global phenomenon, and that something remains elusive despite more than a century of scientific investigation. The scientific perspective deserves its authority when it speaks from evidence and reason, but science is not infallible, and scientific consensus has been wrong before. The history of archaeology itself includes numerous examples of artifacts and sites that were dismissed as frauds or misinterpretations until accumulating evidence proved otherwise. The willingness to consider extraordinary possibilities while maintaining rigorous standards of evidence is not antithetical to science, but essential to its progress. Let these thoughts settle into your awareness as sleep approaches. The scientists have done their work with dedication and intelligence. They have offered explanations that account for much of what we observe, but they have not closed the case. The cave walls still hold their secrets, and the beings painted there still wait for explanations that fully account for their presence. In the darkness behind your closed eyes, you can imagine the researchers in their laboratories and field sites, studying images that refuse to yield their full meaning, working toward understanding that remains just out of reach. The shamanic trance theory is a lens, not a conclusion. It illuminates certain aspects of rock art while leaving others in shadow. The geometric patterns make sense within its framework. The detailed humanoid beings remain mysterious. The disc-shaped objects in the sky resist assimilation to any purely neurological model. The truth may be larger than any single theory can capture, incorporating elements from multiple perspectives into a synthesis we have not yet achieved. Rest now with the question open, unresolved, alive with possibility. The scientists continue their investigations. The evidence continues to accumulate. The ancient images continue to challenge our assumptions about what is possible and what our ancestors actually experienced. Somewhere in the interplay between mainstream explanation and anomalous observation lies the truth about the beings on the cave walls. That truth may be stranger than anything science currently acknowledges, or it may be simpler than alternative theorists suppose. We do not yet know, and that uncertainty is itself part of the wonder. Breathe deeply and let the tension of seeking answers dissolve into the peace of simply contemplating the question. The mystery does not need to be solved tonight. It has waited for 40,000 years and can wait a while longer. What matters in this moment is the recognition that something profound happened in the ancient past, something that marked human consciousness and left traces that time could not erase. The scientists see part of the picture. The alternative theorists see another part. Perhaps no one yet sees the whole, and perhaps the whole is larger and more wonderful than any of us can currently imagine. Sleep now, cradled in mystery. The investigation continues, even as you rest. The alternative interpretation that has captured public imagination more than any other holds that the anomalous figures in ancient rock art represent actual visitors from beyond Earth. This is the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and while it exists at the margins of academic respectability, it has attracted millions of followers and generated a vast literature exploring its implications. To understand the full scope of the mystery we have been contemplating, we must engage seriously with this perspective, examining both its claims and its foundations. The modern ancient astronaut movement traces its popular origins to Erich von Däniken, Swiss author, whose 1968 book, Chariots of the Gods, became an international phenomenon. Von Däniken proposed that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in antiquity, interacting with human civilizations and leaving traces of their presence in monuments, artifacts, and traditions around the world. He pointed to the pyramids of Egypt, the Nazca lines of Peru, the megalithic structures of Pompeii, and countless other examples as evidence that ancient peoples had access to knowledge and technology that could only have come from advanced extraterrestrial sources. Von Däniken's work was not without precedent. Earlier writers had proposed similar ideas, and the notion that gods or angels from the sky had interacted with humanity appears in religious and mythological traditions from every culture. But von Däniken synthesized these ideas into a compelling narrative that resonated with the space-age optimism of his era. If humanity was reaching toward the stars with Apollo missions and space probes, perhaps beings from the stars had already reached toward us in the distant past. Rock art figured prominently in von Däniken's arguments. He drew attention to the Tassili paintings and their strange round head figures. He highlighted images from around the world that seemed to depict beings in suits or helmets, disc-shaped craft, and other elements suggestive of technological civilization. While mainstream archaeologists dismissed these interpretations as fanciful misreadings of shamanic imagery, von Däniken's readers found them persuasive. The images spoke for themselves, and what they seemed to say was that ancient peoples had encountered something extraordinary. Zecharia Sitchin offered a different approach to the ancient astronaut hypothesis, one grounded in detailed analysis of ancient texts rather than visual evidence. Sitchin, who claimed expertise in ancient Sumerian, proposed that the mythologies of Mesopotamia recorded actual historical events involving extraterrestrial beings called the Anunnaki. According to Sitchin, these beings came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago from a planet called Nibiru, genetically engineered human beings as a slave species, and shaped the development of civilization in ways that ancient peoples remembered and recorded. Sitchin's interpretations of Sumerian texts have been rejected by professional scholars of ancient languages, who argue that his translations are inaccurate and his conclusions unfounded. Yet his work has influenced generations of alternative researchers and has contributed to a framework within which ancient rock art can be understood as documentation of contact with the Anunnaki or similar extraterrestrial beings. The suited figures and disc-shaped craft in prehistoric art within this framework represent not shamanic visions, but actual sightings of visitors from another world. Modern proponents of the ancient astronaut hypothesis have refined and expanded these earlier formulations. Television programs, books, websites, and conferences have explored every aspect of the theory, generating an extensive body of work that examines ancient evidence through the lens of possible extraterrestrial contact. While the quality of this work varies enormously from careful analysis to wild speculation, it has succeeded in keeping the question alive in popular consciousness and has introduced millions of people to anomalies they might otherwise never have encountered. The connection between cave art and mythology deserves particular attention within this framework. Every culture that produced rock art also produced oral traditions, stories about the origins of the world, the nature of the gods, and the experiences of ancestors in the distant past. These mythologies frequently include accounts of beings who descended from the sky, taught humanity essential knowledge, and either departed or remained as ongoing presences in the world. The Wandjina of Australia came from the Milky Way. The gods of ancient Mesopotamia descended from heaven. The ancestors of countless indigenous peoples traced their lineage to star beings who mated with humans in primordial times. If we take these traditions seriously as historical memory rather than mere fantasy, the rock art depicting strange beings takes on new significance. The artists may have been recording the same encounters that storytellers preserved in oral form. The images and the myths may represent two channels of transmission for the same fundamental experience, visual and verbal records of contact that was too important to be forgotten. The consistency between the iconography of rock art and the themes of global mythology supports the possibility that both derive from actual events rather than independent imagination. Star maps present another intriguing element within the ancient astronaut framework. Some researchers have proposed that certain prehistoric rock art encodes astronomical knowledge that should not have been available to the cultures that produced it. The famous example of the Dogon tribe of Mali, though not strictly rock art, illustrates the kind of anomaly that fuels such speculation. The Dogon possessed traditional knowledge about the Sirius star system that includes awareness of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star invisible to the naked eye and not discovered by Western astronomers until the 19th century. According to Dogon tradition, this knowledge was given to their ancestors by beings called the Namo, amphibious creatures who descended from the sky. The Dogon mystery has been extensively debated, with skeptics proposing that the astronomical knowledge was acquired through contact with European visitors rather than extraterrestrial beings. But the controversy itself highlights the broader question of anomalous knowledge in ancient traditions. If the Dogon possessed accurate information about an invisible star, what other knowledge might be encoded in ancient sources that we have not yet recognized? Could the geometric patterns in rock art include star maps or astronomical data that we have simply failed to decode? Several researchers have proposed exactly this. They point to rock art panels that seem to depict stellar configurations, to cave paintings that may encode the positions of planets or the cycles of celestial bodies. While mainstream archaeology tends to interpret such images as abstract designs or representations of entoptic phenomena, the alternative view holds that they preserve astronomical observations of surprising sophistication. The ancient peoples who created this art watched the sky with an attention we have largely lost. They may have recorded what they observed with a precision we have not given them credit for. The synthesis offered by ancient astronaut proponents brings together rock art, mythology, anomalous knowledge, and physical evidence from archaeological sites around the world. It proposes that human history includes a chapter we have forgotten or suppressed, a period when extraterrestrial beings interacted with our ancestors and shaped the development of civilization. The strange figures on cave walls are witnesses to this contact, visual records left by people who saw something extraordinary and wanted future generations to know about it. This framework has obvious appeal. It offers explanations for anomalies that conventional theories struggle to address. It connects disparate pieces of evidence into a coherent narrative. It elevates ancient peoples from primitive fantasists to witnesses of genuine events. It expands the scope of human history to include dimensions that mainstream scholarship has ignored or dismissed. Yet the ancient astronaut hypothesis also faces significant challenges. The physical evidence for extraterrestrial visitation remains elusive despite decades of searching. The interpretations of rock art offered by proponents often rely on superficial resemblances rather than rigorous analysis. The tendency to see extraterrestrial imagery everywhere can lead to over-interpretation of ambiguous evidence. And the rejection by mainstream scholarship, while not proof of error, reflects genuine concerns about methodology and standards of evidence. As you rest in the quiet darkness, consider the ancient astronaut hypothesis with neither uncritical acceptance nor dismissive rejection. It represents one attempt to make sense of genuinely puzzling evidence that conventional explanations have not fully accounted for. The beings on the cave walls are real in the sense that they were actually painted by real people who considered them important. What they represent remains an open question that the ancient astronaut hypothesis addresses in one way and mainstream archaeology addresses in another. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these positions, or perhaps it lies beyond both of them in territory neither has yet mapped. The ancient world holds secrets we have not fully uncovered, and the rock art that has survived for tens of thousands of years may contain information we have not yet learned to read. The ancient astronaut proponents remind us that extraordinary possibilities deserve consideration. The mainstream scholars remind us that claims require evidence and that pattern matching is not proof. The mythologies of the world speak of beings from the sky with remarkable consistency. The rock art of the world depicts beings that do not fit any natural category with similar consistency. Whether these two bodies of evidence point toward actual extraterrestrial contact or toward some other explanation we have not yet conceived, they demand attention and respect. The ancient peoples who created these records were not fools. They were intelligent observers of their world, and when they said that beings came from the stars, they may have been speaking a truth we have forgotten how to hear. The Dogon remembered the Namo. The Aborigines remembered the Wandjina. The tribes of the Sahara remembered the beings they painted in their rock shelters. Indigenous peoples around the world preserve traditions of star ancestors and sky visitors that echo through their art, their stories, and their sacred practices. These memories may be distorted by time and transmission, elaborated by generations of retelling, filtered through cultural frameworks that shaped their expression. But at their core, they may preserve something genuine, something that happened long ago and that humanity has never entirely forgotten. Let these possibilities drift through your relaxing mind as sleep draws nearer. The ancient astronaut hypothesis is not proven, but neither is it refuted. The evidence that supports it is real, even if interpretations vary. The beings on the cave walls await explanation, and the explanation that finally satisfies may be stranger than anything currently proposed by either mainstream science or alternative research. The stars wheel overhead tonight, as they have wheeled for billions of years. Somewhere among them, life may have arisen that followed paths we cannot imagine. Some of that life may have developed technology that brought it across the vast distances between stars. Some of those travelers may have visited Earth in ages past, countering our ancestors when humanity was young and leaving impressions that we still carry in our art and our genes and our dreams. This is not certainty. This is possibility, entertained in the spirit of wonder that the ancient artists themselves must have felt when they gazed upon the beings they would later paint on stone. Whether those beings were physical visitors, spiritual entities, projections of the collective unconscious, or something else entirely, they mattered enough to be remembered across 40,000 years of human history. That in itself is remarkable, and that alone justifies our continued inquiry into what they were and what they meant. Rest now with the stars above and the ancient images below. The mystery connects heaven and earth, past and present, the people who painted the walls and those of us who still seek to understand them. In that continuity of wondering, something human persists that transcends the boundaries of culture and time. We are the inheritors of an ancient quest for understanding, and the cave paintings are among the oldest evidence of that quest. Whatever answers we eventually find, the journey toward them honors the artists who began it so long ago. Breathe deeply and let the theories settle like sediment in still water. Ancient astronauts or shamanic visions, extraterrestrial contact or archetypal emergence. The possibilities float in peaceful suspension, none demanding immediate resolution. The night is long, and the questions are eternal. Sleep now, knowing that the inquiry continues, that the evidence awaits interpretation, that the beings on the walls still have secrets to tell. We have traveled far together through the darkness of ancient caves and across the vast expanses of human history, from the painted chambers of France to the rock shelters of Australia, from the desert canyons of Utah to the green Sahara that existed before memory. We have examined the images that our ancestors left behind on stone. We have considered the scientific explanations and the alternative theories. We have weighed evidence and contemplated possibilities. Now, as sleep draws near and the mind settles into the peace of approaching rest, it is time to reflect on what we have discovered and what it might mean for our understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos. The beings on the cave walls remain mysterious. After everything we have explored, after all the theories we have considered and the evidence we have examined, we cannot say with certainty what the ancient artists were depicting. Perhaps they were recording shamanic visions, the products of altered states of consciousness that revealed beings from deep within the human psyche. Perhaps they were documenting actual encounters with extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth in ages past and interacted with our ancestors. Perhaps They were representing something that partakes of both explanations or transcends them entirely, something that our categories cannot adequately capture. What we can say is that the images are real. They were created by real people who considered them important enough to preserve in the most sacred and enduring medium available to them. The artists who painted the Wandjina, the Round Heads, the Barrier Canyon figures, and all the other strange beings we have encountered were not idle doodlers passing time. They were engaged in acts of profound significance, recording experiences or beliefs that mattered deeply to their communities. The care evident in these images, the consistency maintained across generations, the placement in locations of obvious spiritual importance, all testify to the seriousness with which the ancient artists approached their work. The global distribution of anomalous rock art figures ensures that we are confronting a genuine phenomenon, not a local curiosity or cultural quirk. On every inhabited continent, separated by oceans that ancient peoples could not cross, and by time spans that preclude any possibility of cultural transmission, similar beings appear in similar contexts. Large heads, prominent eyes, unusual body proportions, strange garments or coverings, emanations of light or power. These characteristics recur with a consistency that demands explanation. Whatever generated these images affected human communities around the world over tens of thousands of years. The phenomenon was not local or temporary, but sharing. Consider what this means for our understanding of human history. We tend to imagine the ancient past as a time of isolation, when small groups of humans wandered separate landscapes with no connection to one another, and no shared experiences beyond the most basic elements of survival. But the rock art suggests otherwise. It suggests that something connected human communities across the barriers of distance and culture, something that left similar impressions wherever it was encountered, whether that something was internal to human consciousness or external to it, whether it arose from the structure of our brains or from contact with intelligences beyond Earth. It bound humanity together in ways we have largely forgotten. The ancient artists were our direct ancestors, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the most literal biological terms. The people who painted the caves of Lascaux and Chalvet, who carved the petroglyphs of Valcamonica and Sego Canyon, who maintained the Wandjina traditions across countless generations with the same species we are today. Their brains were identical to ours in structure and capacity. Their hopes, fears, loves, and wonder were as real and as deep as our own. When they stood before a rock wall with pigment in hand, preparing to create an image that would outlast them by millennia, they were engaged in a fundamentally human act, the impulse to make meaning permanent, to communicate across time, to leave something behind that would speak to those who came after. We are the ones who came after. We are the inheritors of their message, the recipients of their communication across the vast gulf of time. The images they created were addressed to us as much as to anyone, perhaps more so than to their own contemporaries who shared the same experiences and needed no reminders. The rock art was for the future, for generations who would not remember, for descendants who might need to be told what their ancestors had witnessed. In contemplating these images tonight, we are completing a circuit of communication that began before the pyramids, before agriculture, before the invention of writing. We are receiving a message that has traveled 40,000 years to reach us. What does the message say? It says that something remarkable happened. It says that our ancestors encountered beings that did not belong to the ordinary world. Kaz says that those encounters were important enough to record, important enough to maintain across generations, important enough to place in the most sacred spaces available. The message does not tell us whether the beings were physical or spiritual, extraterrestrial or archetypal, real in the sense of objective existence, or real in the sense of profound subjective experience. It simply says that they were, that they mattered, and that we should not forget them. Perhaps the uncertainty is itself part of the message. Perhaps the ancient artists knew that what they had experienced defied easy categorization, that it occupied a space between ordinary reality and something else, that it could not be reduced to simple explanations. The mystery they preserved may have been as mysterious to them as it is to us. They painted what they saw, or what they believed they saw, without claiming to understand it fully. They left us images rather than explanations, inviting us to look for ourselves and to wonder as they wondered. Humanity's place in the cosmos remains one of the great unsolved questions of existence. We know that the universe is vast beyond comprehension, that billions of galaxies contain billions of stars, and that the conditions for life may exist on countless worlds we have not yet detected. We do not know whether we are alone in this immensity or whether we share the cosmos with other forms of intelligence. The ancient rock art does not answer this question definitively, but it raises it in a way that resonates across the millennia. If our ancestors believed they were encountering beings from beyond the ordinary world, that belief connects to our own contemporary speculation about life elsewhere in the universe. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence continues today through scientific channels, through radio telescopes scanning the sky for signals and space probes venturing to other worlds. But the search also continues through our engagement with the past, through our examination of records left by those who came before us. If contact occurred in antiquity, traces of it may remain in the evidence our ancestors preserved. The rock art is one form of that evidence, perhaps the oldest and most widespread. Whether it proves ancient contact or points toward other explanations, it contributes to our ongoing inquiry into the nature of intelligence in the universe. As you rest in the darkness of this night, let your mind expand to encompass the full scope of what we have contemplated. Picture the Earth as it was 40,000 years ago, ice sheets covering northern lands, vast herds moving across grasslands that no longer exist, small groups of humans making their way through a world that was both dangerous and beautiful. Picture those humans looking up at a night sky unpolluted by artificial light, watching the stars with an intensity we have forgotten, noticing things we no longer notice because our attention has been drawn elsewhere. Picture them entering caves, descending into the earth with the torches held against the darkness, finding chambers that felt sacred and separate from the ordinary world. Picture them mixing their pigments, preparing their surfaces, beginning the work of creating images that would endure for millennia. And picture them painting the beings they had encountered. Beings with large heads and compelling eyes, beings that did not quite fit any familiar category. Beings that had made such profound impressions that the memory had to be preserved. Those moments of creation connect to this moment of contemplation. The artists are gone, their names forgotten, their individual lives swallowed by time, but their work remains, still speaking, still showing, still inviting us to wonder about what they experienced. In your rest tonight, you join a community of wondering that extends back to the very origins of human symbolic thought. You participate in an inquiry that has occupied our species for as long as we have been capable of inquiry. You take your place in a lineage of questioners, seekers, and dreamers who have looked upon the strange figures and asked what they might mean. The mystery does not need to be solved to be valued. Perhaps it cannot be solved with the tools we currently possess. Perhaps the full understanding of what the ancient artists depicted awaits developments in science, in consciousness, in our own evolution as a species that we cannot yet foresee. But the contemplation of mystery has value in itself. It opens the mind, humbles the ego, and connects us to something larger than our individual concerns. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the mystery work upon you without demanding resolution. Let it expand your sense of what is possible. Let it remind you that the universe may be stranger and more wonderful than our everyday assumptions allow. The beings on the cave walls are patient. They have waited for 40,000 years and can wait indefinitely. They do not demand belief or disbelief. They simply are images pressed into stone by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, eyes that seem to watch from across the ages, presences that endure beyond the lives that created them. In their patience, they offer a kind of peace, the peace of accepting that not everything can be understood immediately, that some questions may accompany humanity throughout its entire existence, that wonder is its own reward. Sleep approaches now like a tide coming in, gentle and irresistible. Let it carry you toward the shores of dream, where perhaps the ancient images will visit you in forms appropriate to that realm. The caves are always there, waiting in the darkness beneath the earth, their walls covered with messages from the distant past. The beings are always there, painted in pigments that have outlasted empires, watching with eyes that never close. And the mystery is always there, vast and patient, inviting inquiry that may never reach its end. You have traveled far tonight through time and space, through caves on every continent, and theories that span the spectrum from scientific to speculative. You have given your attention to something ancient and important. It's honoring the artists who created the images and the question of what those images represent. Now it is time to rest, to let the mind process what it has received, to allow the seeds of wonder to germinate in the fertile darkness of sleep. The stars wheel overhead as they have wheeled for billions of years. Somewhere among them, perhaps other intelligences look out at the same cosmos and ask the same questions we ask. Somewhere in the past, our ancestors looked up at those stars and had experiences that led them to paint strange beings on cave walls. Somewhere in the future, our descendants may finally understand what happened and what it means. Tonight, in this present moment, suspended between past and future, you rest in the embrace of mystery, connected to all who have wandered before you and all who will wander after. Breathe deeply one last time and let go. The cave walls hold their images in eternal silence. The beings watch with patient eyes. The mystery endures, beautiful and unsolved. And you, inheritor of 40,000 years of human wandering, rest at last, cradled in the peace of questions that need no immediate answers, drifting gently toward the dreams that await. Sleep well. The ancients are with you. The stars are above you, and the wonder that connects all human beings across time and space wraps around you like a blanket woven from mystery and light. Until we meet again in contemplation, rest in peace, rest in wonder, rest in the eternal human quest to understand.